Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Perceptions of Non-Members and Evidence of Civic Thriving. If you have any technical difficulties or questions during this session, please let us know by typing into the chat box of the webinar control panel. This webinar will be closed captioned, and you can access these captions by visiting http://everfi.com/captions/. It's provided for you up on the image here, so you can go ahead and take a look. We provided the link in front of you so that you can also access it there and in our chat box. A number of you are already aware of Everfi and what we do, but to provide a quick overview in case this is your first time connecting with us, let me introduce you to Everfi. We are a social impact technology company that takes on the biggest social challenges facing our communities. Our campus prevention network consists of a little over 1,200 colleges and universities and national fraternities and sororities, and reaches over 5 million learners with digital training on topics like substance misuse, sexual assault and harassment, hazing, and bystander intervention strategies. Through interactive scenarios, Everfi allows fraternity and sorority members to practice safer decision-making, which leads to safer, healthier environments for everyone. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you our today's speakers. First, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Brian Burkhart, Research Manager at Everfi. Brian is a youth development researcher who has partnered with K-12 schools, with universities, nonprofits, and the military to study ways that young people thrive. His research on positive youth development has been featured in publications such as the Journal of College and Character, the Journal of Positive Psychology, the Encyclopedia of Child and Adolescent Development. At Everfi, Brian leads the research efforts of the Impact and Education team. He leverages education technology and advanced statistical insights to drive social change. So we're really happy to have you on this call, Brian. And our second speaker is Kimberly Timp, the Senior Director of Impact at Everfi. Kimberly has nearly 30 years of experience in college alcohol and other drug prevention. Her expertise lies in program design and development, the application of prevention theory in higher education settings, training and instruction, and methods of evaluation. Prior to Everfi, Kimberly worked at both public and private institutions, and in her current role, Kimberly helps inform the development of Everfi's course offerings. And I'll also note that Kimberly happens to be a Delta Zeta alumni. And our final speaker today is myself. Hello. I'm the Product Marketing Director at Everfi, and I support the development and launch of Everfi's higher education offerings. Prior to joining Everfi, I earned my master's in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I worked at EAB providing best practice research on student success. All right, well, with that, I'm going to pass things over to Kimberly, and she is going to go ahead and kick us off.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I'm just double checking right now that my mic is on. It appears that it is. So I want to get us started by understanding the why behind this research. I think it's always helpful. And this research actually grew out of conversations we were having at Everfi about the future of higher education and looking at measures of student success and identifying some of the challenges that are facing our higher education institutions. And so, of course, in identifying the challenges for institutions, it became, very clear that many of those challenges obviously are similar to the challenges being faced by our national organizations. So in partnership with the North American Interfraternity Conference, we were able to, in the past 6 months, leverage our national data set of nearly 1 million students, which includes fraternity and sorority members, of course, is related to attitudes and behaviors around a number of health, safety, and well-being topics. And we did this to try and better understand how fraternities and sororities can best respond to these challenges and what types of insights we might be able to share that will really help move things forward as we look to the future. So the first why is, again, because our main challenge is that we need to consider how we're going to meet the socially conscious expectations of Gen Z students. These students, as many of you are well aware, are making very socially conscious consumer decisions, including whether or not to join a fraternity or a sorority. And so, for campuses, if they don't get it right around issues like sexual assault, harassment, hazing, or discrimination, the resulting decline in applications they can expect, as U.S. News and World Report had pointed out, is equivalent to a 10 ranking drop. So think of how that translates, to national organizations, because again, if we don't get it right around these issues, we are going to see similar drops, maybe not in rankings, but certainly in recruitment efforts, in our ability to thrive. And many of us, of course, are already seeing this played out in a lot of anti-Greek life movements that are, going across social media and are contributing to some of these narratives. And, even those of us who are doing incredible work, even if organizations are, it's not really easy on our students in terms of how they can identify that. So making it more obvious and promoting, this good work is going to be really important. But just like with higher ed, an organization's commitment to inclusion and some of the social justice issues that are really top of mind right now, that commitment needs to be visible, and more than just a statement on a website or hiring a chief diversity officer. Students today want to see action. And so these sophisticated choices about identity and purpose and values that are driving these decisions about what college they're going to attend, if they haven't already started, this is going to impact their decisions about whether or not also to join, again, a fraternity or sorority. In fact, Ashley, if you move to the next slide, you can see that when we look at data collected from about 5,000 high school seniors that we work with across the country in our K-12 courses, we included a question for seniors who are intending to attend college and asked about how important issues of safety, well-being, and inclusion were in their college decision-making process. And as you see here, over 80% of students said that these issues were as important to them as academic rigor when selecting a college they want to attend. So if they're that discerning about their college search, that certainly has significant implications for the process these students may apply when they're considering whether or not to join one of our organizations. And as we'll see in a moment, our research appears to support that, and Brian will walk us through that in a moment. And finally, the last, or not the only why, finally, but certainly probably one of the most significant whys is because it's time to change that narrative. We have two stories here. On the left, story one really is summed up by a recent 200-page report on mental health, substance use, and well-being in higher education that was published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. In a 200-page report, fraternity and sorority life was referenced only 3 times. And probably not surprisingly, it was to those who are listening in, you'll not be surprised that it was recognized or it was mentioned as a risk factor for things like heavy alcohol use and a risk for sexual assault, sexual and gender-based violence. So the second story, which is the one on the right, is the story we really want to tell, the one we want to move toward, because our findings support a case for thriving among fraternity and sorority members without evidence of deficits in character or academics. And that really tends to be counter to the narrative. But at the end of the day, probably both of these narratives are accurate, right? But only one narrative is really going to enable us to move forward and to thrive. And that's the one that we are hoping to support through doing this type of research. And Brian will also note at later on in this conversation that where we are headed, what directions we're going to take this research in after this initial or preliminary report comes out. It certainly helped us identify some additional areas for study and requests from folks who have read through this report as to what they would like to see us focus on. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Brian Burkhart, who is going to walk through these findings with you here today.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Very excited to be here today, calling in from chilly Boston, and happy to be able to share some of our new research insights with everyone. So these are the 2 lines of research we'll be discussing today. The first one, what are the perceptions of fraternity and sorority life held by non-members? And this is going to bring value to your work, because we didn't just look at non-members in a group en masse. We actually disentangled non-members by those who were interested in joining a fraternity or sorority and then ultimately opted not to, compared to those who were never interested. So we're going to be able to tell you how many of those students there were and what were some of the barriers for why they might not have joined. So you're really going to get a good insight into that segment of the college student population who was interested but did not join. So some really good data points there. The second piece, what unique developmental strengths present among fraternity and sorority members set them apart from non-members. So as Kimberly just outlined, we saw this monumental report on student wellness come out from the National Academies, the preeminent organization on research. And Greek life, fraternity, sorority life is only mentioned 3 times, all as risk factors to negative things. And so one of our sort of ideas from that report was, we're not going to find positive results if we don't start asking positive questions. And not to say that we need to ignore those high-risk behaviors, certainly not. But by bringing strengths to the table, by promoting these strengths in young people, we can mitigate those risk behaviors, actually decrease them. So we're going to show you a little bit of a background on the positive youth development approach. And we're going to see if we can identify some differences between our members and our non-members, not in their risk profiles, but actually in their strength profiles. Are there things that set our members apart from non-members? And how can we leverage those, both to get people to join and to understand all the wonderful assets that are present in the experience of being a member, and also how those strengths can work to mitigate some of those high-risk behaviors. So our first area of study, those perceptions of non-members. So we certainly asked whether or not they were currently a member of the fraternity or sorority, but we also asked whether they had thought about joining and whether they did or not. So we have some nice shades of gray to add to this, and we're going to be talking about some of the barriers. So one thing you might be asking yourself is, how generalizable are these insights going to be? Will these be able to apply to my organization, to my students nationally? Good news, although a lot of psychological research is based on an intro class of psych majors, we at Everfi have a very large data set. As you saw early in the presentation, we have so many partners across the country. So our data for this particular line of research comes from 43 universities, almost 24,000 students, good representation here across gender and ages in school. We did oversample for this research question among our older students. So we have an alcohol EDU ongoing course and a sexual assault prevention ongoing course. So we oversampled for students who have had a little bit more time in college, to have had the college experience, to have exposure to fraternities and sororities, to have made those decisions instead of just only asking first-year students. So we oversampled a bit for our older students, but you can see here a pretty representative sample from across the country, and a good mix of schools, public, private, Northeast, down South, schools with very strong traditions of fraternity and sorority life, large public elite universities in the Midwest, West Coast schools. So really representative sample. So you should feel confident that these statistics we're going to go through in a minute here are going to be generalizable to the students that you work with on your campuses. So next slide, please. So here's the headline: 1 in 5. 1 in 5 students considers joining a social fraternity or sorority, but ultimately decides not to pursue membership. So among all those students we surveyed, this is what we found. About 20% of students thought about it and didn't. So they were at the window at the storefront, they were looking in, and they decided to walk away. So this is a really big opportunity. So walking around in your campuses, when you look around, then you can think to yourself, wow, 1 in 5 of these students thought about joining an organization like mine and chose not to. How can we point that decision to go the other direction? How can we get them to join? What were some of the barriers that pushed them away from joining? So we're going to really spend some time in a minute here looking at this specific segment of non-members, the ones who were interested but didn't join, and also have some insights for the people who were interested as well. So again, headline stat for the non-members: about 1 in 5 students considers joining, but ultimately decides not to. So let's look at a little bit of the barriers that they were talking about. We can go to the next slide, and their overall perception. So as I mentioned, we kind of segmented the non-members into 2 groups: students who thought about joining on the left, and we see a pretty nice normal distribution here. Some students who had a very positive perception of fraternity and sorority life, and some who had a negative perception. So we'll look into that in a second. But on the right, we see students who had never considered joining, and this one's a bit more skewed. And you see very few students who had a very positive or somewhat positive view of fraternity and sorority life. And that might not be very surprising. If they never considered joining, they might not have a great view. But we then asked them some questions about, well, where do you get your opinions from? How did you form these views of fraternities and sororities if you're not considering joining? And you see here about 2/3 of those students said they rarely ever interact with members. But when we asked them where they formed their opinions, it was because of their interactions with members, and a little bit from social media. And so what this tells us is that when our members are interacting with non-members, we really need to stress that they're ambassadors of fraternity and sorority life. We need to make sure that those happen in contexts where healthy behaviors are happening, and we're not reinforcing any stereotypes or risk behaviors. So students who are not considering joining, even though they don't have a very positive view, 2/3 of them are really never interacting with our members. And when they do, we're not really sure what their experiences are, but maybe if the #1 reason that they're not considering joining and not having a favorable view is because of interactions, we really need to stress that our current members are ambassadors at all times. But we do see that students who do consider joining but ultimately didn't do have a more normal distribution, and a lot of students here are viewing fraternity life and sorority life more favorably. So next slide, please. All right, and so here are some of those reasons. Among those students, those 1 in 5, those 20% who considered joining but ultimately did not pursue membership, what were their barriers? What decisions were influenced by these barriers. So here we see kind of a rank order of the reasons that they decided not to pursue membership. The top two here, academics and too expensive, basically across the board, these are our top two reasons. Whether you divided this up by race or ethnicity, by gender, by age, these were always the top two persistently. So remember this piece about being too busy with academics, because we're going to talk a little bit later about self-perceived academic outcomes for our members. But we see these at the top barriers. We then see the third biggest barrier is that folks do not have a good impression. So we're going to talk about that in a second too. But you saw in the previous chart, even amongst the folks who were interested in joining, there was that group of them on the right there who did not have a great opinion. So we're going to look in a second. I think Kimberly will chime in just a second here about what reasons contributed to them not having a good impression. And then as you go down the list, you can see that there's some work conflicts, not being interested, concerns about hazing, lack of diversity. So you can see a rank order here of some of the different ways that people who entertained joining but did not ultimately decided not to. And you can see there were some differences here based on gender, on race, ethnicity. One of the biggest ones on race ethnicity was actually towards the bottom, not sure how to sign up. Even though that's a small proportion of students who encountered that barrier, it was about 3 times greater for students of color not understanding how to sign up. So making sure that we're getting our information out there is going to be important. But I want to highlight now this 40% group and the folks who thought about joining but did not have a good impression and how their barriers were different from the other students. So if we can go to the next slide here.
Actually, I think, yeah, I was going to say
there's the breakdowns.
Yeah, if we could go back
into the breakdowns.
because I want to make sure that, yeah,
we'll go through a few more here. So you see some of our other breakdowns by different student categories. You see a little bit more prevalent rate among women about not having a good impression. You can see here differences in the diversity of membership. So students who are biracial or students of color, a greater proportion of them were concerned about a lack of diversity. As I was talking about a second ago, you see more than 3 times the proportion of students of color saying that they're not sure how to sign up compared to white students. And then you see concerns about alcohol use different between men and women. So these are just some of the categories that came out to us as we did some disaggregating of students who, again, were interested and thought about joining, but did not pursue membership. These are some demographic differences. And again, I really want to break out the 40% here who said they didn't have a good impression and how the rest of the list looks for those folks. And that's a research question that Kimberly was particularly interested in and is going to shine a little bit more light on.
Yeah, so thanks, Ashley. You can thank you. Go to the next slide. So as Brian said, we were really curious, or I in particular was curious about what actually not having a good impression means. And so we took a closer look and we looked at their reasons, this specific group of students, what their reasons were. And we did find some pretty significant differences. And first, what you see here is students with a poor impression were 2 times more concerned about things like hazing, alcohol use, and diversity of membership. So that was one of the first key items, key takeaways. So even though some of those were ranked lower in terms of concerns when we looked at the broader population, when we really dug in to those who had that negative impression, there is definitely significance when it comes to these particular topics. And then we also found statistically significant differences based on race, with 1 out of 2 or 50%, half of students of color, and 50% of students of color, and 2 out of 5 white students noting that a lack of member diversity was a concern. And so those are certainly significant differences in where our students' attitudes fall. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the real specific implications of that moving forward. But the other piece is that 1 out of 3 students of color reported concerns about alcohol use among members being important or kind of contributing to that poor impression, while only 2 out of 5 white students reported that similar concern. So we wanted to do that little bit of digging because we're going to keep going back to that as we talk through some of these findings, because I think when we also look at again, considering this in the broader research around higher education, these are important pieces to consider. So Brian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Kimberly. Yep. So just wrapping up our non-members here was that the big headline again: 1 in 5 students on campus interested, but ultimately does not choose to join. You see some differences based on the rank order, but as Kimberly just shined a light on, really important to see that the biggest difference was when we looked at folks who did not have a favorable impression, 2 times or more students worried about those topics that Kimberly talked about. So we're going to be now discussing, well, what are some ways that we can frame the experience of fraternity and sorority life in a positive light? How can we ask some beneficial questions? And so our next research line of study is called the Positive Youth Development Perspective. So I'm going to do a little bit of a crash course here, but again, if we go to the next slide, we will show you that we have another great representative sample from across the country, almost 50,000 students in this sample from our alcohol EDU course, which is deployed all over. Actually, I took that even years ago when I was a student at college. So alcohol EDU is deployed across the country. And we had another good representative sample here based on gender. We had probably more first year students, but there was enough students from other grades to be able to check that the findings that we're going to share for you in a second are persistent across grade level. But we are excited to expand this line of research, and I think you'll be too when you see some of our results across more courses, across more cohorts, and longitudinally following students throughout their experience in college and throughout their experience in fraternity and sorority life. So again, we're going to have some really good representative data here, over 200 universities, all different shapes and sizes across the country. So you can feel really confident that the numbers here are going to be a good representative sample for students across the country. And next slide, please. And now we're gonna package in a quick graduate seminar in positive youth development. So you'll all get a little certificate after this that you can speak to this and become experts and allies in promoting positive development. So positive youth development really came about in the 1990s as a response to this deficit view. And that was one where youth were kind of viewed as problems to be managed. And we were really focused on mitigating these high-risk behaviors. As a child of the 80s, for us, the DARE program was a good example of that. We need to target these negative behaviors and stamp them out. And in the 90s, these thoughts around strengths building, resilience came about and kind of coalesced in this positive youth development perspective where we're treating youth more as resources to be developed. And we've seen across K-12, the military and cadets where I've studied, and across higher education as well, some positive ways to deploy this model. So the most empirically validated model of positive youth development is called the 5 C's model. And that's what we've got kind of sketched out right here. This was actually formulated through many different psychologists, and then it was a 10-year study in 47 states where the data came from with thousands of parents and their youth, and it's been replicated in higher education and in K-12. And what it says is when we identify individual strengths and we align them with ecological assets, that's our fancy academic term for the social nutrients, the good stuff in a person's context, we see positive youth development. And that's operationalized by these 5 C's, which I'll touch on in a second. But importantly, we see as the outcome of promoting positive development. So again, we're trying to promote these 5 C's. We're trying to find strengths in individuals, whether it's hope for the future, their intentional self-regulation, their intellectual curiosity. We're aligning those with ecological assets. So mentors, the strengths in the family, religious organizations, physical spaces in order to have new skills and experiences. By aligning those things in order to promote these 5 C's, we see as outcomes 2 things. 1, an increase in community contribution. So contribution both to the community, but also to self. So obviously a big service mindset is part of being a fraternity and sorority member. So we see increases in community contribution. And really the kicker here, the important part is reductions in risk behavior. So again, we weren't specifically targeting these risk behaviors like in the DARE program or in other programs. And I will say it's important to target risk behaviors still. When there's safety involved, we can't get rid of those programming. However, having a mindset where we promote these 5 C's, we see reductions in risk behavior. So in K-12, that means lower truancy rates, better grades because they're missing less school, less unsafe sex, drugs, alcohol. In higher education, it's been replicated. We've seen through promoting these 5 C's, reductions in mental health challenges like anxiety and depression. So taking this mindset that we're empowering young people by aligning their skills and promoting the 5 C's, you can prepare them for any set of risk behaviors they're going to come across when they have those critical decision moments. That way we don't need to be able to identify every single one and work in silos, but actually provide them with these social nutrients and assets and individual strengths so that they can kind of overcome any barriers that they come into. And we do see as the results of these higher levels of 5 C's, reductions in risk behaviors. So on the next slide, please. We see just the 5 C's kind of fleshed out. So I'll explain what they are briefly here, this kind of holistic view of positive youth development operationalized. So competence, a positive view is actions in domain-specific areas. So competence could be social competence, physical competence, academic competence. So having skill sets that help you to excel in making friends and having social circles, and maybe in sports or athletics, in school. So more domain-specific mastery of areas versus confidence, which is more of this global sense of self-worth and self-efficacy, kind of this overall feeling of confidence. Connection, these positive bonds with people, institutions. Character, a sense of right and wrong, morality, integrity, ethics, values. We can look to a lot of our institutional mission statements for these words. and caring, a sense of empathy towards others. So fortunately, these are very intuitive words. You don't need me to define these probably, maybe just operationalize them a bit for the academic perspective. But these are the kinds of words that are in our mission statements, that are in our day-to-day conversations about students and about our values on campus. And again, the overall perspective here is viewing students as resources to be developed. How do we promote these things, all of them in our young people, rather than as problems to be managed, and taking that deficit approach? And so this is sort of how the model works. I hope this is intuitive language, but you should also know that this has been empirically validated through statistics. So these are sort of the different areas that we see when we talk about positive youth development sort of writ large. So if we go to the next slide, I'll share some of the ways that we've used PYD in our work, and then after this, we'll talk about how we've seen it in fraternity and sorority lives manifest. So Kimberly and I have been speaking the good word of PYD for a while now and looking at it throughout our courses. In the last year or two, we've been looking at it a lot, connected to our high-risk behaviors with alcohol use. So, one way that we sort of boil down our alcohol prevention programming is, well, kids need to drink less. Well, a lot of kids don't drink a whole lot, but still have a lot of high-risk behaviors going on. And we thought to ourselves, there might be other ways to predict these high-risk behaviors and a better way to talk about this. And what are some ways that we can also use our prevention education platform to give kids the strengths so that those high-risk behaviors are going to be going away and decreasing, because those are still happening. Even with alcohol wasn't part of the equation, there were still going to be kids getting into trouble, not doing well in grades. So what we found was the students who were most impacted by their alcohol use actually also had the lowest 5 C scores, really across the board, and it was very persistent and did align with previous research. And the students who were minimally impacted had the highest scores of character and caring. So again, we looked at all different alcohol use profiles, from people who are very problematic, heavy episodic drinkers, to those who just drink a little bit more moderately or not at all. And we see the students who are least impacted by these alcohol behaviors are the ones who are scoring differently on their 5 Cs. So we see 5 Cs, I would say, is a better predictor of those high-risk behaviors associated with alcohol use than the number of drinks you have. Because there are folks who have very few drinks who still get in trouble with their alcohol-related behaviors, and folks who have a lot of drinks who get in less trouble, probably less common there. But the 5 Cs, a really good predictor of those high-risk behaviors. And then we also looked into the mental health side of things. So there's already published research in the field about how higher levels of the 5 Cs are associated with lower levels of anxiety and depression. We have mental well-being for students courses at Everfi that we've deployed as well, and we saw similar trends. So one of the most interesting trends in the COVID year was asking about if students had a moment of emotional distress and they needed someone to talk to, who would they reach out to? In the past, friends has always been number one. This year, family caught up, probably because a lot of folks are at home now. But again, students talking about their willingness to reach out to their friends, their families, their counselors, or support groups if they were in emotional stress. However, there was a group of students who said no one. If they were having a moment of emotional stress, who would they talk to? And it was nobody. And then perhaps unsurprisingly, we looked at their 5 Cs compared to their peers, and they had lower scores also across the board. So we see higher 5 C scores are associated with lower levels of mental health challenges like anxiety and depression, lower 5 C scores associated with higher levels of risk behaviors associated with alcohol use, and also less of a mindset and less of a propensity to reach out to people for communication. So we see the 5 Cs being really good predictors across the board of overall development and also of those risk behaviors. So that was a very fast-speaking, crunched together graduate seminar in positive youth development and some of the ways it's manifest in higher education, in our alcohol prevention and our mental health prevention. And if you're still on the line, it's time to jump over now and talk about how we see this in our work here with fraternities and sororities. And we see some really great things, some really positive things. So as you saw in those 5 Cs, we deployed a measure of the 5 Cs to all the students who are taking our courses. And we also included in that measure a 6th C, that contribution, which is sort of an outcome, higher levels of 5 Cs. And what we saw here was that between our members and our non-members, there actually wasn't much of a difference in their contribution ideology. So there was an item, for example, it's important to me to contribute to community and society. Very good. So we saw our members and our non-members both answering in aggregate, again, across the country, about the same. Everyone thought it's an important thing to contribute, and you might think there's some biases in there and gotta look good and say the right thing. But whatever it may be, we don't see very many differences at all between members and non-members in the ideology that it's important to contribute. However, when we then ask students, how often do you actually spend your time volunteering, mentoring, and doing service work? Then we see some differences. Then we see our fraternity and sorority members coming out on top. And we see a statistically significant difference of our members. And they answer this question at a higher number and a higher proportion of students saying that they do spend their time volunteering. So this actual action of committing service is happening more often, it appears, amongst members, as well as I feel like an important member of my local community. So another item that members answered with a higher score in aggregate than non-members. So to me, this was some great evidence of civic thriving amongst our members. Of all of the items that we used to measure PYD, in no cases did the members score any lower on any items. So remember, before the data that Kimberly and I presented about academics being the #1 barrier to joining, we asked, and again, this is self-reported data, but we asked members and non-members alike how they were achieving academically and their academic competence, and we saw similar scores. So no differences in self-reported academic competence between members and non-members, which is probably counter to some narratives. No differences in measures of character between members and non-members, also perhaps counter to some common narratives. But what we do see is the examples of members scoring more highly in this contribution service item and the connection to community item than non-members. So some evidence here of civic thriving. Now, again, for our stat people and our researchers on the line, this is more correlational data, and we do want to follow up, as I said, longitudinally and see whether or not we can determine to what degree fraternities and sororities are attracting folks who are more civically minded versus also promoting those things in young people. But of course, based on our mission statements and our work and all of the wonderful nonprofits and charities that our members are associated with, it would not be much of a surprise to see these statistics, but it's nice to see them borne out. I will say the differences, although statistically significant, were modest, about a quarter of a standard deviation. So the effect size is definitely one worth talking about. It's definitely an effect that we're confident we're seeing a difference. And what I'm excited to do, and we'll talk about this more in the future, is now to disentangle that membership experience. So we've got some more items coming up on our future surveys, rather than just asking whether or not you're a member in a fraternity or sorority, asking about the membership experience and the quality of membership. Because in my mind, I would guess and I would hypothesize that folks who are more engaged, who are attending more meetings, who have been members longer, are probably seeing even higher scores on these contribution and civic thriving measures. So that's definitely one thing that I'd like to look at in the future, because again, this is an aggregate. This is against all members, no matter how, how their experience looks, just the fact that they said that they were a member, just in aggregate, we're seeing differences. So being able to determine whether there are specific aspects of the membership experience that contribute in a big way to these are going to be huge. So I'm already comfortable saying that we have evidence here of civic thriving. We see these differences manifesting amongst our members and non-members in big ways, and we're looking forward to following up on these lines of research, because these findings align with what we talk about is so important to the fraternity and sorority experience. So you see here a screenshot of our report, where a lot of these quotes are going to be in there, and what I've just explained will be in there. The numbers are in there as well, the statistics, the effect sizes, the p-values. So for those of our callers and people listening in who are interested in those things, are part of the appendix. But again, I'll sum up here that our key findings, the members are scoring higher than non-members on measures of communities, connection, and service contribution. We also did see some differences in social and physical competence. I remember I talked earlier about those social circles and those domain-specific skills. So we see our members scoring a little bit higher in those domain-specific areas as well. And also the fraternity and sorority members report giving back at higher rates than non-members. And overall, our nice summation of that research is the data supports a case for social, physical, and civic thriving among fraternity members and sorority members compared to non-members, without any evidence of deficits in character or academics. So when we're looking to frame the data we talked about in research question 1 about those barriers and differences to joining, we're looking to frame that and understand how to talk against those complaints and barriers. We've got some really powerful data here that speaks to the strengths of joining and being a member in fraternity and sorority life, and how these positive things are associated with membership. And I think we're going to turn things over to Kimberly now to help us translate some of this information and data even a little bit better.
Thank you so much, Brian. Can you tell how excited Brian gets or is about this particular research, particularly positive youth development? I don't think there's a time that he's spoken that he has not had that same level of enthusiasm for the topic, and that certainly has rubbed off on the rest of us. So what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about what this all means in practice. And Brian has introduced a couple or he's mentioned a couple of the implications of the research, and certainly the report goes much deeper on the recommendations, but I just wanted to highlight a few here. So let's just take a quick look First, I think, as you heard, a major barrier for pursuing membership is academic concern. So we definitely want to amplify messaging around academic performance of members and find ways to promote academic achievement so that non-members, recognize that isn't, again, the narrative. We also want to ensure that we remove as many financial barriers as possible, since we saw expense as also a potential barrier. We want to next, we see that non-member, non-interested students don't really have a positive view of Greek life, but also rarely interact with members. So this is really helpful insight to share with your members to reinforce that need for serving as ambassadors. Even potentially brainstorm ways that non-member students would have the opportunity to interact with members, and think about what are those opportunities and do they reinforce healthy or unhealthy narratives. And so once again, think about what is being promoted. If the only things that students hear or experience about fraternity and sorority life on their campus, really has to do with some of those negative aspects, then we know that that's going to be really much more challenging to change, to contribute to changing the narrative. We also learned that students who have a poor impression are about 2 times more concerned about alcohol use and hazing. And importantly, students of color without a good impression are especially concerned about alcohol use and lack of diversity. So we definitely want to continue to emphasize harm reduction for students who don't drink and educate all members on how to effectively intervene when they're concerned about a member. So again, we're going to model, we want to be models of that behavior, because with that social competence, there is a bit of responsibility that we can take on of not just showing how members of organizations really do embrace this approach, but also how others can as well, and the importance of others doing that. So here again is one of those opportunities to leverage that high level of community connection, because as a highly social population that is really based in traditions and values and strongly rooted in community, bystander intervention actually has the potential to be even more effective than it is in the general population when we think about minimizing the impact of risk behavior. So to be successful in that, we need to make sure that we're collecting and understand correct misperceptions or perceptions of social norms and try to correct those, especially that perception around willingness to intervene. And so we need to gather data on the actual prevalence of these behaviors for given chapters and among your membership, and so that we understand how accurate these perceptions are in comparison to the reality of members' experiences. And then also, again, although smaller proportions of students of color choose to drink compared to white students, alcohol consumption rates overall have been on a downward trajectory for the past decade. So these trends, when considered in concert with some of the other concerns we've talked about previously around alcohol use and hazing, means that it's going to be increasingly important for organizations to provide an experience that appeals to infrequent drinkers and abstainers, because those students are going to continue to make up a larger proportion of the college student population into the future. And since many of these negative perceptions are strong among students of color and center around recruitment barriers, it could be potentially helpful just in general to do an audit of the recruitment process. And that's something that I'm sure many organizations already do. Some of these are things that organizations already either consider, probably already performing, but this just reinforces the need to do that and to potentially do that really maybe in a different way or through a different framing, because we see students of color less aware of how to sign up for fraternities and sororities. So maybe if not already doing so, consider things like ask, is the process easy and transparent no matter a student's background? And that's whether it's racial diversity, whether it's students who may not be as present on campus, if they're a commuter, or have other barriers to recruitment. When would they find the information? How do they access that information? How are we collecting or collaborating rather with cultural and affinity groups to understand and address potential barriers? This is where we can leverage that social competence, right? Because you've got members who are happy and engaged and willing to go out and have conversations with folks, and have them reach out and say to these organizations, all right, how do we engage with students? What are some of the barriers of students who are members of this affinity group or members of this cultural group? What is something that is potentially a barrier that we can try to address? And then again, what benefits are we promoting? Are we promoting all those strengths and benefits that we've talked about here today? How can we infuse those, whether it be directly or indirectly? And again, leverage that social competence, leverage these strengths to empower members to answer some of these questions and to pressure test some ideas with that. And I want to wrap up these recommendations because I think I would like to share a great example of how one organization is already demonstrating their commitment to changing the narrative that we've been talking about. And I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that FISIG is the only organization doing this work, or that it's the only way to operationalize the work that we've been talking about. But, you know, I am familiar with FISIG. We've been working with them for a number of years, so are more familiar with their efforts. And to me, the statement, with a quote here from Director Nick Zuniga, is pretty clear: is stepping out of our mold. It's about creating a vision and identity that is consistent with being better men for society and aspiring to be more. I really feel like that resonates with a lot of what we're talking about. Their strategic plan, you see the 5 areas that are highlighted in that plan. Membership development, alumni membership, growth, safe environments, and funding and support. I'm sure those aren't all dissimilar to you know, some of the strategic plans and mission or vision statements of other organizations. But what I wanted to do is highlight, and I only have time, you know, to highlight one area. So want to just briefly speak to the one of the safe environments and safeguarding our chapters, because this is where we start to see you know, how the language we've been using and the research and how that is being incorporated into this particular strategic plan. So goals like ensuring environments are designed for academic and collegiate success by moving chapter houses towards substance-free learning communities first, or ensuring that Phi Sig men maintain healthy relationships with students in their campus community. So not just with one another, but in the community. So that recognition of community, that recognition of the importance of healthy relationships. The inclusion of safety and well-being in such an intentional way here really highlights the recognition of the changing student population and the identity that they're striving to build. An identity that challenges that popular narrative and is intended to move the organization, as Nick says, forward. And so I want to thank FISIG for allowing me to highlight their work. And I want to turn it over now to my colleague, Ashley Linsenberg, who's going to talk a little bit about how we are actualizing some of these findings in the upcoming course and the intentional way that we have looked at this research to inform how we approach this new course. Ashley, take it away.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Brian, as well, for sharing all of this research and all of these insights. As you have heard today, fraternities and sororities really have a unique opportunity to transform the way that they're viewed by the campus community, and to actually highlight some of the best parts of being part of a Greek organization. Those elements of community and leadership and camaraderie and support that do exist between brothers and sisters, and the positive benefits that your members receive from their experiences in your organizations. And one of the best ways to deliver this message is through your campus, to the campus community and to potential future members, is through the actions of your members, who really are the ambassadors of your organizations. They're the ones who are really going to be the ones who are having conversations, changing minds, encouraging new folks to rush and to become part of your organizations. And so this course really did look at how we can pull elements of positive youth development and positive social norming to help build and reinforce all of the positive elements of fraternity and sorority life, and to be able to share those out with people who might not be part of your organizations, and to really change the way that they're seen on campus. So when we developed Community EDU, we did keep a lot of the key themes and content from Greek Life EDU, and I think several of you on this call will be familiar with that course already. Community EDU is an enhanced, evolved version of this course. We've kept some of the critical key parts of that content. We've also added some new enhancements. So from a content and design structure and looking at the course itself. So I want to dive into a little bit of what those investments are that Everfi has made that is really sort of changing the game and the nature and really improving and building on what we already had today. So with Community EDU, we've reimagined some of the scenarios in which learners explore how to identify and take action when problematic behavior occurs. And we did this to make it a little bit more relevant to the college experience. So for instance, calling out cyberbullying in one of our guided scenarios is one way that we do that. We've also updated the base on which these courses are built. So that makes them a little bit more accessible. They are now compatible with smartphones, tablets, and laptops, so your members can take them on multiple different devices, wherever is most convenient for them. And we've improved the overall accessibility so that all learners can have a high quality learning experience when they complete our course. And this is so important to reinforcing your messaging and reinforcing the fact that you really do care about inclusion and supporting all members of your community across all different abilities. And finally, we've added some additional points of configuration so that when you add additional content and context and resources to the course, you can really make it your own. And so what that does is it really helps you take what it is and in terms of what we're teaching in terms of the content, that positive social norming and that positive youth development, and draw really direct ties to your organization's values, initiatives, and goals, and really make it really make those connections very clear. Community EDU was really developed to help educate and prepare your members to create safe, welcoming, and inclusive communities where everybody can thrive. It's built on that foundation of Greek Life EDU, as I mentioned, but we have some new content, some new scenarios like we just talked about, and we'll be looking at 2 of those in more detail in just a moment. But I want to just talk through some of those critical topics that we are addressing to make sure that everyone's just aware of what is in this course. So we've got, we're still looking at those table stakes key issues around sexual assault prevention and substance misuse prevention, but we've also expanded them to include some new information. So things like nicotine and prescription drugs are also included in substance misuse prevention as well. And when we address culture building and hazing, we double down on some of the core values and the positive ways to build community. So really looking at those elements of positive youth development, looking at those 5 C's, looking at how we can really look at what does a positive community development look like, and how can you be orienting your members towards really engaging and embracing programming on those fronts. We've also added a brief introductory module on mental health and wellness that introduces your members to strategies for self-care, but it also will help your members identify when brothers or sisters might be in distress, and it gives them strategies for reaching out and offering support, and how to connect them with additional resources. We do also have a fuller, more robust mental health and wellness course offering that you can access, but we did want to include some of this information up front in this course as well. So let's go ahead and take a deeper look into 2 different areas, building community and mental health and well-being. So as you heard from Kimberly and Brian earlier, community is a huge part of what your members love about their organizations. And as we talked about some of those promising findings about the positive impact that being part of a fraternity or sorority can have on an individual, being part of your community just really speaks volumes. And the best way for you to communicate and to combat some of the negative culture, the negative impressions that you do hear about, or to help reframe the narrative around those 1 in 5 students who decide not to rush, is really through firsthand experiences of interacting with your current members and having them talk about their own experiences. So what this course is really meant to do when we talk about building community is we want to reinforce the positive elements of community building, setting the expectation that bonding happens through constructive activities like games and leadership and teamwork and volunteer work and group study sessions and other outlets that really align with your members' goals and values. Everfi focuses on positive social norming, so this course really focuses not on telling you what negative behavior looks like, but what positive behavior looks like and what the benefits of positive behavior can be so that you can chart a path towards those experiences. And then looking at the second thing that I want to double down on, mental health and well-being, this is something that's new into this course. We have a new module on mental health and wellness. We do talk about personal self-care, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about supporting peers in distress, which is one of the other topics that we address in this module. Community is incredibly important, and as you heard, that when students are in distress, they are looking to turn to their friends and to their families, and their brothers and sisters in their sorority or fraternity are going to be a key part of their support network. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to give your members access and information about how to identify when a brother or sister is in distress, how to reach out to them, and how to support them through that conversation, and connect them to the resources that they need to continue their health and wellness journey. So here what we do is we actually introduce a strategy that was developed by Active Minds called the VAR method, validate, appreciate, and refer. And it's an approach that can really make a strong difference in making sure that when your members are having conversations with each other and they're navigating some very vulnerable and honest conversations, they're feeling the person who is sharing that information feels supported and cared for, and the person who is receiving that information knows how they can actually be supportive and caring in that conversation. So let me talk a little bit about what each of those three phases are that are included and that are walked through in our course. So the first one is really just validating someone's opinion, or validating what they're feeling. So when someone comes out and says that they are feeling in distress or they are feeling like they're going through a difficult time, letting them know that feeling that is okay, that you believe them, that you're hearing them, and acknowledging that whatever it is that's going on is real and makes sense and that you're listening to them. That feeling of being heard makes them more open to then continuing to talk or being more open to looking and exploring what to do next. The next thing is to appreciate their courage, because it is a hard thing to do, to admit when you're struggling, and letting someone know that you're glad that they opened up and acknowledging that you're taking that they're taking a step might not be easy, but knowing how to have that conversation, knowing what words to say, knowing how to acknowledge and honor that conversation is really important. And what it does is it builds a ground for trust and support. So what you can do is then look at that third step in the VAR method, which is referring someone to more skills and support. And that's where you can start, moving someone to appropriate resources, because sometimes a brother or sister, they might just want to have someone listen to them and feel heard, but sometimes they might be indicating that they need additional help or additional resources. And so at that point, what we do is we help your members understand how do they actually make that handshake, bridge that gap to the next thing. It might be something as simple as just saying, hey, do you want to get some fresh air and talk? Or asking, how does your work-life balance feel right now? Or maybe a meditation app that I use might be really helpful to you. Or if they think that it's more serious, they know how to start the conversation of, do you think it might be helpful to talk to someone? I can stay with you while we go and do something. But what we do is we provide that information, that context, those guidance, and that direction to help members of your communities really support each other and make sure that someone is getting seen and heard and then helped in the way that they need to be helped. And these are just two examples of some of the things that we do in Community EDU to really help create that big and supporting community where you are actually out there watching out for each other, supporting each other, and helping each other grow and thrive. And so with that, I think we'll move over to the final slide of today. If you're interested in learning more about this course, there's so much more to talk about. There's so much more great content. Please let us know.
So Ashley, while folks are filling out this poll, one of the things that I wanted to highlight from what you said is a couple of things, is looking at the research or the data that folks will have through using this course. And one of the pieces that we added that I think is really relevant for this audience is we've added some questions to get the perceptions of members on how well they feel their organization, the national office and leadership of the organization nationally are addressing some of these issues, like mental well-being and health, like diversity and inclusion, like substance misuse or sexual assault. So getting their kind of high-level opinions of where do we need to do more work, and providing that opportunity for them to share that. The other piece I would note is that as you were talking about the mental health piece, Ashley, I was reminded, having gone through the script and seeing these the course as it's been built, is that what I have grown to appreciate is that the mental health piece is connected to other modules as well. So even though we have these separate modules, we're very intentional about pulling some of these themes throughout. So mental well-being is addressed within the context of hazing, for example. As we talk about hazing, we reference back to the importance of mental well-being and how hazing can impact someone's mental well-being. So not just about the outcome of hazing, but what the lasting effects can have on an individual from a mental health standpoint. So I think there's a lot of great examples here, and thank you for taking the time to share some of those with us. If we have any questions, you can certainly type them in the panel on the right. We're happy to answer those questions. You can also reach out to us following this webinar, and we'd be happy to connect with you. So I will give it a few minutes, see if anyone has any questions. Brian, is there anything that you would like to leave folks with? Anything that you didn't have a chance to mention, or that occurred to you as we were continuing to talk?
I mentioned as much as I could in my time, but yeah, I guess one thing that came to mind as Ashley was going through the course was I hoped everyone can see sort of the elements in the DNA of positive youth development showing itself in our course modules and leveraging those strengths, like Ashley had mentioned, of peers, of community, in order to build up those skills. So I would hope that you could maybe use some of your new knowledge on positive youth development to look at your own programming, your own community. As much as we're experts in prevention education, and using technology for social impact and our statistics, you're the expert on your members, on your campuses and in your communities. So you know the strengths that are present there better than we do. So find ways to leverage those. As Kimberly said, members are more often than not very social, seems to be more athletically inclined. How can we leverage those things? So we've done what we could with our courses, but please take these lessons and use them across the other ways that you work with your students to build up the positive context and also kind of leverage strengths in individuals. So give people leadership responsibilities for service, give back, all hallmarks, but we're hoping we show you that the data bears out the importance of these kinds of things. So I hope it's helpful in your work. And I do see some questions coming in, Kimberly. This first one might actually be for you. Does this course expand to non-sorority and fraternity life chapters? For example, student organizations?
So love that question. And this is a conversation we've been having. So I will say more to come on that. Our hope is that, in creating this, the framing of community EDU certainly applies to multiple organizations and in multiple settings. So this is community EDU, fraternity and sorority life, and it provides us the opportunity to potentially expand to community EDU for fill in the blank student organizations or leadership programs, or however it could potentially be used. We do get some requests for that, so hopefully that gives you a little bit in response to that question. Nothing yet, but do stay tuned.
Another question came in, Kimberly, too. This is probably a good one for you, having just reviewed the course script so closely. Is how are we addressing the differences in hazing prevention between fraternities and sororities?
So I think that we're not necessarily we're not calling out the differences. What we're doing is recognizing them in the way that we incorporated material. So we know that hazing looks different for fraternities and sororities, and that's based on research as well as our. We engaged a group of leaders from national organizations, had a think tank pulled together to help inform the course content. And one of the things that was very clear is that yes, that hazing looks very different. And in fact, for sororities, it often can be in the form of more along the lines of bullying, sometimes cyberbullying. And while it happens across the board, those may be more prevalent. So we've incorporated that. And in fact, the cyberbullying is a scenario around body shaming. So and we did not specify gender in that. So we've been very careful to provide a lot of different examples of how hazing and or bullying occurs and how to respond to that and what it might look like. And so like I said, it's not divided by fraternity versus sorority because some of these things actually do cross over both, but we wanted to make sure that we were covering information that is relevant to both and not just fraternity focused. And we know that tends to be the case when talking about hazing.
Yeah, I will say too, having authored the surveys for their courses, that we're going to be collecting data on hazing and on bullying in separate kind of sections. So we've operationalized what both of those mean, asking learners whether they've experienced it, engaged in it, been a victim of it, bullying separate from hazing. So we'd be able to disaggregate, of course, by organization, by gender identity, to see if there are differences in the experience and prevalence along those lines. In addition to lots of other fun survey questions we've added about the quality of those are the ones I'm most excited for: the quality of experience, the engagement, the tenure, how long you've been a member, how often you are interacting with other members. I think that engagement is such a good predictor for so many other outcomes. And we talk about institutional outcomes like academics and retention rates, belongingness, as Kimberly highlighted and actually did. These are so intersectional, and it's so important to kind of look at each of these in view of other topics. So we're excited to be able to do that with some of our survey data for next time out. So it looks like we're about at our end here. Ashley, are you going to be bringing us home for our sign off? And if not, that's okay. I will
That's
just, yeah, I will say thank you so much for your time, everyone. Please reach out and contact us if this resonated with you, if you have follow-up questions. We look forward to using our data to be able to support your important work in the future. We're excited to unveil the new course in May, and we think it really is up. It's going to be addressing all the big topics we need to hit as this community, as well as really using all the latest research and all the latest surveys and data to really support you in your important work and to keep our students safe and promote their health and well-being. So thank you so much for the time. Kimberly, I don't know if you have a final thought for the group.
That'll do it. Thanks,
Great.
everyone, for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Read the report. Let us know if you have any questions, and good luck with your important work. Bye-bye.